Okay. Thank you for coming to our last noon lecture of the year. Uh, One would not realize that it is supposed to be spring. That's how the last noon lecture usually is. But you've all made it through this kind of typical Michigan April, so thank you very much. I'm Chris Hill from the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures. I teach Japanese literature and cultural history. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Christopher Bush today for our final noon lecture. Chris, as he's known, is associate professor in the Department of French and Italian at Northwestern University and also in the program in comparative literature, and he directed that program for a number of years. Chris earned his PhD in comparative literature at UCLA, and before Northwestern had taught at and done research at Princeton and Indiana University. Chris has been very active in working on European and American literary modernisms and their literary relations and their imaginative relations with East Asia. And his first book came out of those interests. It's called Ideographic Modernism, China, Writing, Media, which was published in 2010. It is a book that examines the work of Claudel, Pound, Kafka, Valéry, Benjamin, and among other things argues that the ideograph, so-called, is an invention of European modernists. And with that as a point of departure, he begins a really deep exploration of questions of representation in modernism. Chris has been very active in comparative literature as a field and as an institution. In 2005, he co-edited a special issue of the journal Comparative Literature, responding to an important book by Gayatri Spivak called Death of a Discipline, which was predicting the demise, perhaps, of comparative literature. And he's worked very hard to bring Asian literatures into the comparative literature conversation. And this is one of the reasons that I wanted to bring him here today to speak with us. He's trying to bring Asian literatures, Chinese, Japanese, into the comparative literature conversation, not as a supplement or as part of what you could call sort of an arithmetic solution, sort of add a little bit, add some more literatures and then conflict becomes global, which is not proven to be a very good approach, and Chris is working on something different. So for several years he's been working on a project about imaginings of Asia, and specifically Japan, in Europe that upset the usual sort of interpretation of those sorts of engagements with Asia as Orientalist, as just imagining that that Asia, Japan, China can only be the exotic other. And he's sort of taken on those interpretations of so-called japonisme and chinoiserie to argue instead that, explore images of Japan in European modernism as modern, as maybe radically modern, perhaps more modern than Europe at the time. And so on that note, and that's what brings us here to listen to him speak to the Center for Japanese Studies, and his talk is entitled 36 Views of the Eiffel Tower. Please join me in welcoming Chris Bush.
Let's see. Am I on? Hearable? Okay, great. I'm sorry, I have a bit of a sore throat, so just, make a, like you're making a bet, raise your hand if I'm too quiet. It's really, it's a great honor and a slightly daunting one to be here at such a prestigious center of Japanese studies, since I am not a Japanologist and do not pretend to be one. But my experience, in fact, has been over the years that very often people in East Asian studies are more welcoming in a general sort of way, and also in very specific intellectual ways, really much more prepared and interested in engaging with the kinds of projects that I'm doing than often people in French or German studies, for reasons that I think have to do with the kind of, the pseudo-universality of studying French literature, for example, or studying English literature in a literature department and so on. So I hope that will be the case today as well. Since there's a lot to get through, I'll get right into it. All right. Cultural critics and historians have long remarked the disparity between the Western dream of Japan and the realities. Less shrieky? Less shrieky? Okay, good, good. Long remarked on the disparity between the Western dream of Japan and the realities of its modern history, between the timeless fairyland seen on many a vase and jar, on many a screen and fan, as in the Mikado, and the technologically advanced nation whose conquest of much of East Asia and the Pacific was already underway by the turn of the century. And indeed, such iconic images as the Japanese bridge of Claude Monet's Water Lily Pond seem to belong to a different world from that of the lurid iconography. Oh no, this is, oh God, what a nightmare. I'm sorry, they did something at the hotel that was, they mixed up. I hope this is hilarious. There are two slightly different versions of the slides. Come on. No? There we go. There's Monet's bridge. That looks much more like a bridge, doesn't it? Monet's Water Lily Pond seem to belong to a different world from that of the lurid images of Yellow Peril, much less the realities of modern Tokyo with which they were contemporary. Right here we have a kind of classic Japanese image from Whistler. It is no wonder then that most critics believe that the Western enthusiasm for Japanese art and culture, Japonism for short, must have emerged in ignorance of and indeed despite Japanese modernity. Accordingly, Japonism has been devalued as a form of aestheticism or exoticism or Orientalism, that is, as either a flight from modern Western realities or a more or less pernicious fantasy about Japanese difference. But ironically, because Japonism itself is held to be uninterested in history, it is seldom itself studied historically. And so the misinterpretation creates a kind of methodological prejudice that reinforces the initial misinterpretation. And then the term becomes a kind of trans-historical club with which to beat someone. So you can say that Roland Barthes' Empire of Science is a Japanese book, and it's always a bad thing if something is Japanese. Right? Against such conceptions of a superficial aestheticism or a merely fashionable exoticism, whose forms and meanings were fixed by the well-known Japonisms of French Impressionism and Madama Butterfly, this project tries to analyze an alternative tradition, one that places Western literary, critical, and cinematic uses of Japan into the context of Western interpretations of Japanese modernization and modernity. A tradition that, far from being nostalgic about a vanishing old Japan, represents a complex and self-conscious aesthetic response to Japanese modernization, often understood precisely as a bellwether of globalization. The Japanese aesthetic is allied with modernity in the program of liberating the present from the weight of the past. So this aesthetic is not about a representation of some pre-modern elsewhere, as in exoticism, but a formal aesthetic model for representing the here and now, of wherever that might be. Right? So today I want to provide a kind of an overview of that book project with somewhat more detailed discussion of a few of the examples that I think are suggestive of the project's larger questions and arguments. The book itself is currently a mix of the kind of fairly well polished and even published, the sketched out and the frankly a bit sketchy. I'll try to give you a mix of all three today. The three main examples I'll focus on are a series of prints from 1902 by Henri Rivière, 36 Views of the Eiffel Tower, of which this is one. Oscar Wilde's 1891 essay, The Decay of Lying, a few French haiku from the First World War, and finally a brief moment from Wim Wenders' 1985 film Tokyo Ga. So first, Rivière. To begin, let's take a look at what a contemporary art critic Arsène Alexandre called, quote, the last great artistic monument of Japonism. Here's the cover. Henri Rivière is perhaps best known today, if at all, as the designer of the shadow puppets for the Chat Noir cabaret. Right? From the fall of 1887 into the spring of 1889, Rivière made drawings and took photographs of the Eiffel Tower while it was being constructed. The tower would be officially inaugurated in the spring of 1889, 2 months before the opening of the Universal Exposition, of course. Here's another one. You see the tower sort of in the background there. Off in the distance again. Over the following decade or so, Rivière would return to that material, developing the photographs and using some of them, along with new work based on the completed tower, as here, as the basis for a series of 36 images, which would be completed in 1900 and published 2 years later in a book designed by Georges Auriol, a typesetter and artist also associated with the Chat Noir, and a prologue by Arsène himself. This is some work by Georges Auriol, who did the typesetter. You can see, obviously, he squarely fits into the Japanese camp. You can tell from his visual style. You'll probably recognize this Chat Noir poster from many a home decoration store. I pulled this particular version off a Pinterest site dedicated to various versions of this image, which can be found on mugs and throw rugs and anything you can really imagine. So he's sort of famous for that image, but he's actually sort of an interesting figure in other ways, and specifically was sort of important as a typesetter. He did the design for the book. I should also mention that while Rivière did learn woodblock carving in a traditional sense, this print series actually they're all lithographs. So the images are lovely, they're interesting, I think. There's a certain cleverness to them, a certain charm to them. Although some of them taken in isolation, such as this one, might seem to border on a kind of fin de siècle kitsch, right? A kind of Japanese beautification of Paris, right? But taken as a series, I think that they are not ultimately aestheticizing. The tower is very much part of the modern world of construction, and for many Parisians, it is a distant and even ironic icon of the Belle Époque. We see the smoke pumping out of the boats on the Seine. We see the tower in the distance, barely distinguishable from the clouds there, in what looks to be sort of a poor peripheral neighborhood. And here a man who appears to be homeless. The tower sort of barely detectable in the background there. Okay. So the point being that the Japanese elements of Rivière's work are not at odds with a kind of documentation of the present, or even showing the sort of the unevenness of supposedly the Belle Époque society, the kind of thing that T.J. Clarke famously talks about in The Painting of Modern Life, that although Impressionism is ostensibly a celebration of the pleasures of everyday life, it also shows a lot of other things. Related to this, we see in these street photos by Rivière a lot of the compositional techniques that are always used to bridge Japanese influence into Impressionism, particularly in the works of, say, Degas or Caillebotte, for example. The cropped figures, the high horizon lines, the negative space, the asymmetry, and so on. This connection between photography and the sort of Japanese print series is nowhere more apparent than in this juxtaposition of images. On the right, we have a photograph taken by Rivière from the Eiffel Tower while it was under construction. This guy's painting it. And then on the left, we have a print that was made from it several years later. The compositional techniques used here estrange the everyday not through some kind of special effects, but through the sorts of denaturalized point of view and perspective that would later be associated with certain kinds of modernist photography. That image on the right, people always think that it's from the 20s or the 30s, right? Something like a kind of new vision photography structure, right? And in fact, we find this something very similar in even more of Rivière's images. These are again from the late 1880s, right? Sort of looking down from the tower, using the sort of industrial structure of the tower as a frame to create this sort of flattening out of the pictorial space, et cetera, in ways that would be very, very famously celebrated in relation to Moholy-Nagy and other photographers in the 1920s. So this one on the left here, for example, is a series of photographs taken looking down from the radio tower in Berlin. Right? So I see this as there's a kind of a genealogy here, right? That Moholy-Nagy is doing a series, and that Rivière, too, is looking down from a radio tower. Of course, the Eiffel Tower is not yet a radio tower when it's being built, but it will become one and will become sort of iconically one in French modernism later on. The Japanese film historian Daisuke Miyao has recently argued for an understanding of Japonism as existing at a nodal point of what he calls a nodal point of an intermedial network, including, according to him, painting, the novel, theater, photography, and the newly emergent cinema, including, he specifically mentions, this film by the Lumiere brothers, which consists of a single shot about 50 seconds long. I didn't realize it had a soundtrack. That's all. We don't need that. So Miao, in fact, specifically compares this clip by the Lumiere brothers to Riviere's photography and makes it a central part of his argument for a kind of cinematic influence on Japonism and even a Japanese influence on early cinema. There's a fairly well-established conversation linking Japonism and photography as related influence on Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, but I think this connection to cinema and a broader intermedial landscape really opens things up and suggests a whole set of new possibilities. Let's catch up. There we go. All right, back to our snow tower. So overall, the points I want to make about Rivière are less about him per se and more as a model for my approach to Japonism in general. What we have here is not a representation of some pre-modern exotic elsewhere, but a use of Japanese aesthetics, as imagined anyway, as a model for the aesthetic presentation of the here and now. Let me say a little more about the here and the now. The here, as I've suggested, is not beautifying necessarily, at least not always. Throughout the prints, we find workers, signs of industrial production, diggers on the canals, smoke coming up from the boats. Alexandre, who wrote the preface, Arsène Alexandre, who wrote the preface that I mentioned before, writes, quote, "To be sure, Rivière would have preferred to have Mount Fuji on the horizon as he strolled around, Fujiyama with its marvelous shape, but we each have the Fujiyama we can find. It would be wise to be satisfied with this one when you can't have the real one, and it is fine to be able to enjoy the spectacle you are about to discover. The Eiffel Tower," he then adds, "is, quote, just a big stick from which to hang kakemono." Right? He describes it as, quote, a mere pretext, an excuse for describing everything admirable nearby. And it's this last point that I really want to emphasize. Yes, the tower is a kind of ersatz Mount Fuji, right? But the purpose of the substitution is not to transport viewers to some imaginary Japan, but rather to, quote, and again, these are Arséne's words, already back in the first edition of 1902, to describe the haunting beauty of Paris, to tell it again in all its forms and colors to those carefree, ungrateful Parisians who are forever forgetting it. To make this album a memento of beauty for those who live now and a testimonial for all those who will follow. Right? So there's a sense of it actually creating, and this is why he calls it a monument, right? There's a sense that it's a kind of a record of a particular period, which gets us to the now. Right? The Eiffel Tower, as we'll see in this picture here, if you look at the top, it's actually incomplete. Right? It was supposed to be torn down, and in fact, when it was originally built, much like many of the other other buildings that were originally constructed for the Universal Exposition, and you can see some of them in the background, which no longer exist, in fact. So this is less a monument. In this moment, the Eiffel Tower is really less a monument than an event, right? And this is part of the series of lithographs kinship with photography or with the actualité that the Lumiere brothers are filming at this time. It's a memento or a testimonial of a contingent sense of place. This is a particular part of 1 year, right? And then the idea is that it will be gone. Rivière's prints make the everyday world of Paris visible in ways that would otherwise not be available to those who live there, according to Alexandre. There is nothing more pleasant than these images that, quote, allow us to stroll through the present, says Alexandre. This is all the more important because unlike the monuments of the ancient cities of the world, Paris will never become a ruin in antiquity, says Alexandre. Again, this is all in the original preface. The tower will rust and disappear or be torn down, and so will live on only in images. Alexandre attributes to the images a documentary and therefore ultimately a historical function. He writes, and this is my last quote from him, "Thanks to these images, our successors may stroll about a city that will have been completely transformed, and the one we know now will have vanished." Right? Évanoui dans les airs. Right? Kind of suggesting kind of melting into air, right? This kind of sense of the So again, really, I want to just convey the sense that the whole aesthetic that Alexander's suggesting here is not, here's this monument which signifies Paris, right, but that this is sort of a current event that's transforming visual sensibility, and he's thinking about what this will look like 100 years in the future, 500 years in the future, quite explicitly. All right. Let's move along to Oscar Wilde. This is possibly the single most infamous passage in studies of Japonism. Probably most of you have seen it many times before and might even be tired of it. So I won't spend too much time on it, but I think there are a couple important things to say. The character Vivian in this essay says to his interlocutor that the Japanese aesthetic sensibility so prized by his contemporaries should not be accessed by journeying to the other side of the world, but rather through a kind of aesthetic re-education, through looking at Japanese art, which will then teach you how to look at the world differently. In fact, he writes, and this is the sort of the infamous part, the whole of Japan is a pure invention. There is no such country, there are no such people, and so on. Stay at home and steep yourself in the work of certain Japanese artists. Then go out some afternoon and sit in the park or stroll down Piccadilly, and if you cannot see an absolutely Japanese effect there, you will not see it anywhere. In this turn of phrase, the Japanese effect has become a kind of trope in the studies of Japonisms, and that it's used in the titles of books and so on. What I want to suggest is that Vivian is not wrong. That although the passage is generally quoted out of context to condemn Wilde's Orientalism and its erasure of the reality of Japanese artists or even of Japan itself, but in fact, it's very clear from the context that what Vivian is saying is that it's the Japan that is imagined backwards from its art that does not exist, right? It's not that there's not a real place, right? He's saying that much like the Middle Ages that we construct romantically out of what's left of its art, or ancient Greece that we imagine backwards from the statues that are left in ruins and stripped of their colors and so on. The Japan that we imagine is not the Japan that we are getting from its art. And he says this very explicitly. Right? He even mentions the sort of decoloration of Greek statues as a sort of an example of sort of modern confusion about how things actually were in the past. Right? And last but not least, I should mention that just because a character says something in a text written by Oscar Wilde, that doesn't mean that that's Oscar Wilde's opinion, right? This is the other thing. This is always quoted as, Oscar Wilde says, right? Oscar Wilde doesn't say it. Right? Sort of like that moment in Ulysses where Stephen Dedalus' teacher scolds him with a quote from Shakespeare that's actually a quote from Iago. Right? He says, as Shakespeare tells us, it's actually Iago justifying his wicked ways. And in fact, it is, just to recall the obvious, Japanese critics and scholars of Japan who have emphasized the most the invented character of any Japan that's said to be demonstrated or expressed through artistic sensibility alone. Aesthetics have played such a prominent role in national and imperial and global constructions of Japan and in the critiques of these things that there's actually something prescient, I think, about Wilde's remarks. And it is indeed precisely in his influential critique of aestheticism that Karatani Kojin affirms Wilde's provocation. Quote, as Oscar Wilde pointed out, Japan was from the beginning an aesthetic fiction. Right? He calls it a shinbi-teki na fiction. To consider certain Japans as inventions of art, then, is not to retreat into a dehistoricized or apolitical aestheticism, but rather to acknowledge the profoundly historical and in many cases ultimately political question of art's role in the invention of Japan and of place and of period more generally. Right? So Vivian's remarks debunk naive notions about the link between style and place, but there is also a registration that is here affirmative, and that is its aestheticism, I think, of the disconnection, of the floating character of a certain style, recognizing that one might indeed see Japanese effects in Piccadilly or on the Trocadero, for that matter. And there's a corpus to prove it. Much of Impressionism and Post-Impressionism suggests that people were seeing Japanese effects when they walked around the European capitals. A particular modern history of circulating art objects then produced an image of Japan, but it also produced a way of changes in the way people perceived and represented the world around them. This image from Rivière is from the exact same year as Wilde's Decay of Lying essay, 1889. I think it's interesting to think about this as a Japanese effect, right? When we hear the expression Japanese effect, I think we probably tend to imagine, cherry blossoms in Washington, D.C. or something like this, right? But this is, I would argue, very much the kind of Japanese effect Wilde had in mind. But what if Vivian's interlocutor, Cyril, had behaved like a tourist and gone to Tokyo? There's much evidence to suggest that especially in Japan, he would have found Japan to be a kind of aesthetic fiction for him. In Pierre Loti's even more infamous Madame Chrysanthemum, a text that maybe we can talk about later, which was published just 1 year before Wilde's essay, the narrator at first delights in what he calls, quote, this tiny, artificial, fictitious world, which I felt I already knew from the paintings and lacquer and porcelain I had seen. It is so exact a representation. Long before I came to it, I had perfectly pictured this Japan to myself, he writes. And this is a very common sentiment among Japanese travelogues, right? The idea of it's as if people had jumped off the pots or come to life from the prints and so on. This is sort of a cliche in the literature. But on the other hand, in the very same text, and just a few pages away, Loti also complains that Nagasaki, quote, looked like any other commonplace town, a tangled mass of vessels carrying all the flags of the world, steamboats, just as in any other port, with dark funnels and black smoke, kind of like the ones we saw in Paris, leading him to envision the total death of the exotic. And again, this is my last quote from Loti. Someday, when man shall have made all things alike, the earth will be a dull, tedious dwelling place, and we shall have to give up traveling and seeking for change, which no longer can be found. So perhaps a certain skepticism about the aesthetic experiences of travel was justified on Vivian's part. So this seems to be a kind of a contradiction, right? Japan, on the one hand, he says Japan is exactly like its exotic representations. On the other, he says it's just like everywhere else in the world. Right? But I want to suggest that these are two sides of the same coin. In a narrow sense, this is the dynamic of Orientalism, right? The circulation of representations that instill a desire, and perhaps even a desire for difference, and perhaps even some sense of knowledge of difference. But this very same circulation implies forms of real-world connectivity that themselves contribute to increasing sameness. Right? If you like the look of a place from which someone has sent you a postcard and you then visit it, you shouldn't be shocked to discover you're not the first person to have ever been there. And yet. Right? So in some respects, this déjà vu is a symptom of Orientalism in this narrow sense. We could think of Ali Badad's Belated Travelers as a great example of a treatment of this. But it might also be seen as defining certain aspects of modernity more general, as in Dean McCannell's now classic text, The Tourist, or in Timothy Mitchell's notion of an exhibitionary regime. For Mitchell, modernity involves not just an increasing number of representations of the world, but also an increasing transformation of the world into something to be represented. Transformed into tourist sites, for example, or perhaps transformed into something postcard-worthy through the construction of a more or less useless tower in the middle of Paris. Okay? A tower that has some slight utility, but whose utility is actually dwarfed by its value as an object of representation. And indeed, then sort of as a kind of additional irony to this, when travelers from around the world, from Latin America and East Asia, and so come to Paris and see the Eiffel Tower and so on, they sort of are both comment on the sort of the unreal quality of seeing this thing that they've seen so many times in pictures, and also how it's kind of disappointing because it looks just like everywhere else now, and so on. Right? So with Loti, we have a representation encountered as a reality, but sometimes this sort of déjà vu is even stranger when, for example, the reality seems to precede the repetition in a very specific sense. And I'm thinking here of Benedict Anderson's numerous invocations of José Rizal's Noli Me Tangere, a novel from 1887, also from this same period, in which the protagonist, having returned from a 7-year stay in Europe, experiences an uncanny disidentification with the gardens of his native Manila, which are for him, quote, shadowed automatically, inescapably, by images of their sister gardens in Europe. He can no longer, Anderson comments, matter-of-factly experience them, but sees them simultaneously close up and from afar. The novelist arrestingly names the agent of this incurable vision, el demonio de las comparaciones, right? Or this, he calls it the specter of comparisons. And then many years later, Anderson says, well, it should be more like the irritation of comparison or something like that. It was sort of pretentious the way I translated it back then, but now it's kind of become a trope. It becomes the trope of the name of one of his later books, even though he also cites it in Imagined Communities. So for me, it is telling that what is perhaps the most influential theory of nationalism the last half century should repeatedly return to a scene in which the experience of national belonging is represented not by a kind of centripetal imagining of community, right, but by the spectral presence of other distant nations, or rather nations that are described as, quote, at once near and far. So if the template for the generic nation is supposed to be the creation of unity out of difference, right? That's what the imagined community is supposed to be. For nations explicitly framed as belated or peripheral, the problem was rather one of negotiating this kind of uncanny mixture of sameness and difference, right, between one's own nation and others. Right? This is this very passage is in fact discussed by Harry Haratunian with respect to Watsuji and some other Japanese writers, but I want to connect it here specifically to a very famous essay, Kobayashi Hideo's Literature of the Lost Home from 1933, in which he somewhat famously writes, "We feel closer to the Moroccan desert we have never seen than to the landscape of Ginza before our eyes," speaking of the film Morocco with Marlene Dietrich, of course. Kobayashi describes the erosion of any sense of home as part of a universal crisis, his term, that belongs to modernity in general, but he feels that, quote, contemporary Japanese society is collapsing in a quite distinctive way. What is distinctive about, for Kobayashi, I think, is the claim that, quote, we can no longer distinguish what is under the force of this influence from what is not. The erosion of home for him is an effect of the erosion of a sense of memory that would be solid enough to create a distinct sense of environment. And a firm sense of environment is produced by the accumulation of what he calls firm images. I'm emphasizing his word choice a little bit because it will come back at the end. Right? Where there is no memory, he famously says, there is no home. And while he does have memories, there are, he says, something vaguely fictitious about them. This is Dorsey's translation. I think Anderson says dreamlike. It's, well, anyway, we can talk about that if you want. So this is an essay that's sort of famously seen as embodying the sort of broader Japanese problematic of the internalized gaze and a sense of kind of self-disidentification as definitive of modernity. What I want to suggest here is that we can see links between these three moments, between Wilde, Rizal, and Kobayashi, in their common sense of dislocation of place. A Japanese effect, a European effect, let's call it, in Manila, and something that I don't think we can call a Moroccan effect, but something that has nonetheless taken on a kind of iconic status in the study of modern Japanese culture. These specters or irritations of comparison are less the ghosts of, say, past, present, and future than expressions of different geopolitical positions, or at least the imagination of different geopolitical positions. Now, clearly, the specter of comparison that might occasionally haunt Piccadilly is pretty benign, right? Especially compared to, say, the heart of darkness that runs through Conrad's London at the end of his novel, for example, right? Probably the most famous image of sort of the periphery in the center in modernist literature. But even in its sense of unreality, I want to suggest these experiences of sort of uncertainty of place signal real historical relationships. Behind Morocco, there's what we might elsewhere call westernization or media effects. Behind the gardens in Manila and Rizal's feelings while he's there, there's the entire history of Spanish colonialism and the way that's shaped his experience of the world. And behind Wilde's Japanese effect, well, something else, right? And that's sort of what the book is about, is trying to figure out what is the real world historical context that makes this possible and indeed meaningful. So what I want to suggest is that Japonism is global, Japonism was global rather, in a double sense. First, that it was widespread throughout far more of the world than is typically acknowledged. It's not limited to a handful of European cultural capitals and drawing rooms and so on, but something that was in fact found throughout much of the world, including, depending on how you define it, in parts of Asia and much of Japan itself, which I don't think is too provocative of a thing to say. I mean, there's a pretty extensive discourse on the idea of auto-orientalism and self-orientalism and so on that one could refer to from Japan specialists. Second, so there's that sense in which Japonism was global. It went a lot of places, right? But it was also global, I think, in the sense that it was about imagining various specific places as part of an interconnected cultural and geopolitical system, right? It was in some cases very explicitly and self-consciously about trying to imagine one's place in the world. So again, it's not really about Japan per se, but somehow the aesthetic forms of Japan come to be the best way of representing the strangeness of how being in any specific place somehow always connects you to elsewhere in the world. All right. So the book then really has two broad goals related to reflecting these 2 points. First is to provide a partial history of non-Japanese, and especially Western, for lack of a better word, Japonisms, right? To show that these are more extensive and significant and interesting than is usually credited. in terms of their global reach, in terms of the archive that exists outside of the canon, but also through its presence within the canon. This wide view of history with a lot of examples sort of runs from the middle of the 19th century to pretty late in the 20th. And each chapter really includes bits from France and Japan itself, but also a variety of spaces that would traditionally be identified as semi-peripheral. For my Japonisms, Japan was a model whose aesthetic forms could be repurposed to create a specifically modern art of one's own time and place. That this Japonism was not primarily about having, so the point is that this Japonism was not about primarily having a window onto a unique utopia of pre-modern Japan, or even some unique Japanese aesthetic essence, but rather about this problem of the art of one's own time and place. But what that means, and then this is where sort of things become complex and interesting, is that of course depends on the time and the place, and then also of course it depends on the art, right? What is the medium and what is the genre, right? The question of what it means to make properly national painting versus what it means to make properly national poetry versus properly national cinema and so on. These are questions that vary a great deal for the people who are concerned about those things according to medium and form, just as much as they do from historical moment and context. So that's the one big goal, that kind of intellectual historical goal. The second major goal is more theoretical, right, which is to bring out something like the double consciousness of European modernity, its specters of comparison, to consider Japonism a kind of found experiment in the provincialization of Europe. This is in part based on the words of historical writers who variously hoped for and feared different kinds of Japanization, and talked about the modernization of Japan as signaling the end of history, already in the middle of the later part of the 19th century, and even fairly far back in the 19th century. This goes back way before Couchoud. That's chapter 1. Right? But also through my own efforts to treat the European material simply as part of a global Japonism rather than as its originator and paradigm. Right? This is why I often put the French examples last, even though that's what I'm focusing on here. So in contrast to what we might think of as post-colonial, decolonial theories that ask, how can I talk about some non-European X without the mediation of Eurocentrism? My question is instead, how can I work on Europe in a way that's not Eurocentric, or is at least less Eurocentric? Right? So then the question, the bigger methodological question really is what is used to explain what functions as the context for what? Right? Do we think of what's happening in Paris as a kind of norm in relation to which everything else is measured, and so on. These are familiar questions, but I think this is a historically privileged way of kind of flipping them on their head. Right? And so this is the aspect that I think that might potentially be of interest to people who don't necessarily work directly on Europe, but who, for one reason or another, remain sort of entangled in its intellectual lineages and histories, which is almost everyone. So I'll try to, I'm going to run out of time a bit, but so I don't want to give too detailed of an outline of the chapters, but I'll just say that the first chapter really is on discourses about Japanese modernization in the late 19th through the early 20th century that see Japanese modernization as signaling the beginning of a kind of westernization and modernization of the entire world, and therefore the end of history as such, because there will be no cultural difference. Now again, this is a kind of a familiar conversation and as a sort of, an 80s, 90s, early Aughties conversation, but what I try to show is that there were very, very explicit similar things being said already in the 1870s, 1890s, and during the First World War as well, right? And that the logic is the same. This picture, which I would describe as a picture that is not interesting, is interesting because it's not interesting, is actually a snapshot taken by Couchoud while he was at Miyajima. He actually took he collected an enormous number of postcards and took a lot of photographs, and there was an exhibit of these a few years ago, and there's some really interesting writing on it that basically argues that they're all sort of deliberately extremely banal, right? That the photos and the postcards are sort of indistinguishable one from another, right? And that they represent a kind of serial art form. So they're all from the sort of late 50s, early 60s. Just to give an example of the kind of early historical thing that I'm talking about, this is from the second chapter, which looks at Japonism in the more conventional sense, that is to say the kind of enthusiasm for Japanese art and craft in the later part of the 19th century. This is from Ernest Chenot, who's an art critic and an artist who attended all the world exhibitions and wrote some of the earliest writings on Japanese art in French. After attending the 1867 World Exposition, he wrote a series of essays, one of which which were then collected into a volume called Rival Nations in the Art. And it described all the art that he saw at the World Exposition in terms of a kind of a great competition among all the different nations of the world. And one of those 3 essays is dedicated entirely to Japan. Okay? But the essay that talks most about French is characterized almost exclusively by an enormous anxiety about the loss of French national culture as an effect of globalization and the increasing sameness of every place in the world. Right? And so there's a long quote here. I won't read the entire thing here, but you can see that what Chénaud imagines is a kind of giant civilizational shift in which some people of the future, right, what he calls the unknown races of the future, right, if I can, this is sort of this key term here, right, the unknown races who take up the scepter of the world, right, look back on French culture of the 19th century and say, there's nothing here. It's just kind of a mishmash of Greek and Italian and other styles, right? There is no national style. And then he suggests, as do so many other people, that Japan provides the model for what it means to have a truly national style, right? So the move here is actually to try to then look at the ways in which this idea of Japan as a model, it's a little too early, it really plays out in different situations. So there's a sort of a Polish-Japanese movement that sees it as a potential weapon for reasserting the distinctness of Polish culture against Russia, right, at a time when Poland is seeking nationhood. There's the Bengal Renaissance, of course, which is a case people may be more familiar with, and so on, right? And so what I try to do is kind of see these things as connected moments in which there's a very, very similar discourse. People are all reading Okakura and so on, right? But that there's a kind of global conversation in which the point is not, again, Japan as an object of exotic representation, but as a model that can be used in that place to produce a modern national art for that time and place. And of course, the urgency of that in Bengal as compared to, say, France or whatever might be quite different. But what I want to suggest with this example is that even in France, there's an enormous amount of anxiety about the loss of national culture and the sense that Japan is going to sort of save them. Right? And then there are various sort of in-between examples. For example, Austro-Hungary, which from the perspective of many people in the world would represent the center or a center of European culture, but from their perspective is a kind of a backwater that's trying to catch up with London and Paris and so on. And they can do this by, guess what, borrowing from the Japanese and imitating their models of national culture. The 3rd chapter, and I'll try to sort of race towards the end here, deals with a variety of different ways of writing, of modernist literary writing that are imagined as or described as being Japanese. Right? The first section is a very broad thing that tries to sort of link turn-of-the-century Japanese writing with the art of the sketch or the impression or the literary postcard and so on. These are interesting texts, I think, because they are produced at a time when very, very little Japanese literature is known in Europe. It's almost entirely based on sort of analogies with woodblock prints or things from the visual arts, right? So you have people writing these little prose sketches or prose poems, and then critics saying, this is just like Japanese literature, even though they have actually no examples of Japanese literature at all, right? But what they mean is that it reminds them somehow of the aesthetic, right? And in the same way, these that I've been emphasizing with the visual arts, these texts are not about Japan as a rule, right? The tradition I'm looking at, they're kind of reportage of everyday life. They're about the little things of time and place. And there's even kind of regionalist schools of haiku, which is then the second section where we turn to the haiku proper, which is obviously a more, clearly Japanese form, right? Whereas the turn of the century short prose are sort of amorphously Japanese. In the way they're identified, we get an actual French and Spanish and English language haiku movements in the teens and 20s. Of course, the imagism of Pound and his friends is well known in the English-speaking world. But one of the things I try to show is that there was a very widespread movement in the Spanish-speaking world and French in particular. This is from the earliest collection, possibly the earliest collection of European language original haiku, written by someone named Paul-Louis Couchoud, who was a sort of a philosopher and scholar of religion who'd spent some time in Japan and learned some Japanese. And this haiku is some of you may know, is kind of modeled on a Buson haiku. And what he did with a group of his friends, he took a trip on the Seine through the canals around Paris. So right, again, these little boats, traveling around the base of the Eiffel Tower and so on. And they wrote haiku. And they just took a trip and wrote little haiku about the things that they saw and then assembled them into this series. Right? So again, there's sort of all these analogies with the woodblock prints and so on. But where I think things get really interesting is about a decade or so later, Couchoud becomes the kind of the elder statesman of a French haiku movement that involves many, many poets who fought in the war. Some of them become famous later, like Paul Éluard, who's one of those 3 or 4 principal figures of the surrealist movement. He wrote haiku while he was in the war and published a series of, I believe, 11 of them during the war, and they actually kept them in his complete works. It's one of the few things from his early poems he kept in his complete works throughout his entire life. He knew Couchoud, he knew all these people. These are from a poet whose pen name is Julien Vaucans. He was considered to be the best of all the war haiku poets. This is from a collection called 100 Views of the War. Right? And he originally actually wanted to call it 36 Views, but then there was a thing with the editor and he sort of had to change it, and the series was longer and so on, right? But he describes it actually in one of his essays about it as a kind of cinematic, he calls it a court métrage, like a short feature about the war, right? So this is kind of cinematic assemblage quality to it. I picked these as examples because you can see the kind of ironic deployment of Japanese motifs in the fan and so on, and then the techniques of juxtaposition. There are many other poets who are associated with this movement, but he's certainly the most famous one, the most widely reviewed. This was out in 1916 already. Traveled around the world, actually surprisingly influential, but then forgotten. It's actually quoted in, if anyone knows Brazilian modernism at all, in the preface to what's considered the kind of the foundational text of poetic modernism in Brazil. There's a preface by this guy, Paulo Prado, who's sort of the sponsor of all the poets. He's a very rich coffee grower. And he has in this essay a quote from a Japanese haiku poet, right, which says, "The Japanese poet wipes his blade. This time eloquence is dead." Right? And it's a reference to the Paul Verlaine poem about twisting the neck of haiku. But in fact, it's not a Japanese poet at all. It's Julien Vaucans, right, who wrote a kind of an avant-garde manifesto about haiku poetry and so on. So the last chapter is on film. I just want to show you one little clip about this. This is a structure you will, of course, recognize. I don't know if you recognize these guys. They're a little younger than in this picture than they are now. This is Wim Wenders and Werner Herzog. This is sort of a shot taken on location when Wenders was filming Tokyo Ga. I just want to find the first couple, show you just about a moment of this. You'll see why. They go to visit, you can see the Tokyo Tower in the background there. And then we get this shot, which I think is fantastic. Very familiar, right? And then this leads, I'll just give you about 20 seconds of this because it's very long. You can see it's all about reproduction and seriality.
A friend of mine, Werner Herzog, who was stopping over in Japan for a few days on his way to Australia. We talked.
Es ist ganz einfach so, dass es Bilder nur noch wenig gibt. Also wenn man hier so rausschaut, das ist ja alles zugebaut, da sind fast nicht mehr Bilder möglich. Man muss also wie ein Archäologe mit dem Spaten graben. Und man muss eben schauen, dass man aus dieser beleidigten Landschaft heraus noch irgendetwas finden kann.
Okay, and so on. So it's very Werner Herzog. It goes on for a very long time. He says that he's seriously considering trying to work with NASA to go on a space shuttle because of that outer space might be the only place in which it is possible to get pure images anymore. At one point, this is the most wonderfully Herzogian moment. He says, "I don't complain enough about how difficult it is to do cinema," which of course, if you know him, is delightful. So, part of the reason I wanted to show this is that even in this moment, which is very easy to read in terms of it's a film that's contemporaneous with Blade Runner, it's very much about Tokyo as a city of electronics and simulacra and so on and so forth, right? That there's this very explicit link to this long tradition of Japanese representation on a formal level, but also on a thematic level, right? And that you can actually go back to the turn of the century and the construction of the Eiffel Tower and see a kind of direct connection between these things as sort of related commentaries on modernity. I wanted to end with this complementary image of the unfinished tower. I have a longer sort of fantastical version of imagining Mothra as the angel of history. But I think that's a little too silly since I've been here for an hour already, but just to say, I would love to talk about that over lunch if anyone has the stamina, and I think this would be a good thing to leave up during conversation. All right, thank you. Sure. Okay.
So, thank you very much, Chris. And there is time for questions. I might just start off with one that came up as you were talking. You said toward the end of your talk that japonism had become a sort of repurposable aesthetic, if I'm probably misparaphrasing you, that was circulating around the world. So could you say a little bit more about how it was circulating and how that was related to the initial sort of appropriation in kind of the era of high japonism, if you want to say that, in France and in England?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for example, that there were certain features of, like to take the woodblock print, for example, that there were certain features of that were appropriated for purposes that really go beyond anything that has to do with their original intent, right? So what I mean by that is there was a constant emphasis on the idea that one of the things that was special about Japanese art was that, yes, it was beautiful, but unlike what was beautiful in European art, it was mass producible for cheap, and it was easy to move around, right? And so one of the things that the woodblock print is seen as providing is a kind of a model for sort of mass art, right? And so it becomes associated with things like little magazines or eventually film posters and so on, right? So there's a kind of relationship, obviously, to the tradition of illustrations of kabuki actors and representations of places, the stations and the trade routes and so on. But it gets sort of reinscribed in sort of very specifically European ideas of like sort of local color and regionalism. But also what I'm suggesting, I think, is in the Rivière case, for example, is a kind of proto-city symphony, right? That you get this kind of literary and cinematic and photographic genre of this sort of this sort of kaleidoscopic construction of cinema, right? And that's, I think, you can imagine a line that goes back to the woodblock print series, but I think to say that somehow that Hokusai was already doing that in some ways is really sort of an abuse of, it's kind of an anachronism. So that would be one example, I think, is the sense of the scalability that they saw in the print becomes tied to discourses about mass reproduction that have to do with photography and cinema, but also to do with certain kinds of economic issues, and then the need to sort of compete in a sort of global art market.
To touch on your point, Chris, thank you, Chris, for your presentation. It's very informative. I'm curious about where sexuality configures in this, given that when one, you said Bart, for example, and his very homoeroticized representations of Japan, and even Hokusai with Shunga, and the way Shunga was circulated in Japan, or excuse me, in Europe. Through tin cans, I know I read, you've been doing a lot of research on representations of sexuality and the way that it was circulated. And I'm just wondering where, and in Proust, for example, in the Goncourt brothers, they had a hidden stash of Shunga that they never wanted to share with anyone else because that was considered the
Yeah.
So where in the construction of modernity does sexuality fit in, the fluidity of sexuality in the same way that you talk about the fluidity of representation?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think the best, most honest answer to that is to read Christopher Reed's book, Bachelor Japoniste. I don't know if you've read that yet or not, which is great. And then also Joss Lavery's probably forthcoming book on Victorian Japonisms, which I've read early portions of, and deals with sort of very similar issues. It deals with sort of essentially queer Japonisms using the term in a sort of its most expansive sense, right? I think in my case, it's something that at some point I just decided to have to not deal with it because the topic's already sort of it's too much already, right? It's too expansive. There's too many countries. You know, I'm sort of literally learning languages to write chapters. You know, this kinds of, or whatever, learning languages, but you know, sort of studying languages to write certain chapters and so on. And there are many things that are religion, for example. You know, the centrality of Buddhism for many of the early Japanese. It's not a superficial thing. You know, even people like Berti and so on who are thought of as merely aestheticist, aestheticizing collectors, they were very serious about what they understood Buddhism to be. I had to sort of prune all these things out to try to have a relative clarity of line across all these different countries and periods and media and genre and so on, and make it about this problem of the world picture. But I will say that just so that it doesn't seem like I'm being completely evasive, since I did mention Madame Chrysanthemum, for example, I mean, that's a book that I don't talk about it in here, but I have a specific reading of it that is very different, I think, than the conventional reading, which is I see that as a primarily homoerotic text in which the bride, the chrysanthemum character, is, I think there's no consummation of that relationship at all. I don't think Loti, the narrator, has any kind of sexual contact with her at all. And in fact, everything he says about her, he's kind of repelled by her. And she talks about her sort of as a child or as a toy, right? And this is always read as, it's a perfect example of this kind of, you know, sexual objectification. She's like a child or a toy. But not everyone thinks children and toys are sexual, right? In fact, most people don't, right? And so when he says this, it's precisely desexualizing. He's uninterested in her. He's much more interested in the guy that he's traveling with, Eve, right? But this is a book that always gets read back through Madama Butterfly, right? That it's always like every instance of, you know, we have a European man. I mean, it's all the fingerprints are there, right? He goes to Japan, he buys a young bride. Like, obviously, we know what happens, right? But I think if you actually read the book, that's not what happens at all. Right? Because Loti has his own particular kind of sexuality, and it's related to his childhood and this kind of melancholy that he's going through and so on. So just to say that I think that I don't want to seem as if I'm sort of simply dismissing it as a non-essential question, but also to say that I think that it is possible to bracket it in ways that can be really productive, because sometimes that there's a very familiar critique of Japonism that doesn't actually always fit the objects, right? Like, it's certainly, you know, I have no desire to defend. It's not the question of defending the book. I mean, things can be awful in different ways, right? It doesn't mean that, you know, it doesn't mean that it's good, right? But I think it's just not bad in that particular way. So for him, I think it's more about objects and representations and so on, and that's why it's about his childhood. It's a kind of, his queer relationship to Eve is a kind of fantasy of a sort of pre-sexual status, basically. Please, go ahead.
I was really interested in use by Rivière of lithography to kind of replicate the look of woodblock, especially after kind of the previous generation of Japanese men printmaking was all etching.
Yeah.
The look is so different.
Yeah.
So I was kind of curious if you think of the use of this medium, which was kind of evolving rapidly during the period, was also part of what about this series was kind of modern. Also,
Yeah.
whether lithography then is used also in Japan in this period?
I don't know if lithography was used in Japan in this period, so I'll say that. That part I can answer. That's a very easy answer. I do think it is part of the modernity of it. I know that Rivière was just learned lithography like a year to two before he started doing this series, and he wanted to use this new technique. He has other series of woodblock prints that, for example, of waves crashing on rocks and so on, that look very, you can almost imagine them even if you haven't seen them. They're at, think of the cover of a Debussy CD or something, and that's what they look like, right? And I mean, they're lovely in their own way, right? But I think what's actually important about it is precisely as you say, that lithography would be understood as modern, right? And that we shouldn't sort of retroactively read this as a kind of beautification, just as a kind of, it's a technology, or at least the way it's being used, not the overall technology, but the use of it at that level is new, and again, it's a way of allowing for a kind of mass production and a mass reproduction, right? And so it's not about, you know, creating this sort of singular or art object, right? But it's a technique for dissemination of images, right? And it's a very conscious production. He chooses his typesetter. He chooses the person who's going to write the preface. The book has an unusual cut. There's a facsimile of edition that you can buy, and so on. It's a marketing. I mean, he has this whole back and forth about how many views there should be because he wants to evoke hokusai and so on, because it'll be better marketing and so on. So I think that kind of, and he's a shadow puppet maker, he's a photographer, he's a painter, he does woodblock work, he keeps switching, right? He's constantly changing media and genres, and I think that that's part of the story, is it's not, if we just say, it's an imitation of woodblock techniques, it seems like this kind of narrow transfer, but I think it's actually more interesting to think of it as part of a sort of a series of different media that are being used. And in fact, the last thing I really discuss in the book, I think, is Chris Marker and his relationship to Japan. He's someone, again, who constantly changes medium, right? He's a novelist, video, film, DVDs, it doesn't matter, right? Whatever the new technology is, he wants to make something in that new technology. And there's a way in which I think Rivière is like that, right? So then the presence of the tower, for example, that's an appropriate subject matter for someone who's using a new medium. He's also taking photographs at the same time. Like he's at the cutting edge of technology in a way, even if it might seem sort of belle epoque to us looking back at it now.
If you have anything to say about my comments or questions, I would need to have you talk slower.
Okay.
And a little louder for me. I'm sorry.
Okay, no, not
Yeah.
I tend to be fast and a little quiet, and I have a sore throat today, so
Oh.
I will do it.
Yeah.
But I will do that.
Okay.
Please.
I could not have a picture like that in my home. It would rain in my heart. And I love the Eiffel Tower. I've been to Paris only 3 times and the Eiffel Tower, and took my son once. And I love Paris, of course, whether it's springtime or any time.
Yeah.
And what, have there been, like, anything about that got me thinking, have there been any terrorist attacks where it's huge, I worry, but sometimes the terrorists are going to go after the Eiffel Tower or the
Well, they do all the time in movies.
Yes.
And in television, right? And this is sort of the longer thing that I would want to say, is that I think I guess I would say there's 3 pieces to this idea that, in a way, is a little whimsical, but there's a serious point I want to make, right? Which is one is that even at its construction, the Eiffel Tower is being described and imagined as, in terms of its future disappearance or ruin, right? That it's thought of as this ephemeral thing that will flare up, and then people are already imagining what it's going to look like in the future, right? As strange as that might seem to us today, right? The second thing is that I think it has a very privileged status as an object of destruction in movies and television. There's a website you can find that actually lists all the movies in which the Eiffel Tower, either the Eiffel Tower is destroyed or is seen standing alone, kind of broken, surrounded by destruction, right? It's a very standard establishing shot for like an apocalyptic scene. Chris Marker's La Jetée has it, for example. There's a lot of different scenes like this, right? And the Tokyo Tower then sort of, I think, takes on that role too as the kind of signifier of a place. The landscape can be otherwise decimated, but you know where you are because you have this kind of little stub of a tower or something like that, right? And it even becomes a joke. I mean, I have these young kids, and there's in the Cloudy with Chance of Meatballs 2, there's a fear that the food will begin traveling around the world and destroying monuments. Is the way they put it, right? It's this, and the Eiffel Tower is the one monument that they didn't destroy in the first movie, right? This kind of thing. So just the fact that it sort of appears on that level of popular culture, I think, shows that there's this recognition that that's a stereotypical thing. When the aliens invade, they blow up the Eiffel Tower. There's this kind of thing, right? So I think that it's not just, I think it's not just trivial, because the Eiffel Tower is a signal of a certain era, right? It indicates a certain conception of modernity, and it's thought of as global in a certain way. Right? It's not just any old thing. There's a sense that somehow Paris is being destroyed, like a certain version of the world is being destroyed. Right? And then I guess the third piece then is to then think about how this plays out in the idea of the Tokyo Tower as a funny kind of double or simulacrum, right? Because I think it too is already, it was a very short gap between the time the tower was finished and the time it was first destroyed on film, right? And it's also been regularly destroyed on film ever since, right? And so I think that there's a kind of, I guess my ultimate point would be that this is a bit sort of, I worry that this is a bit too cute, and so I have to think it through, but that there's a kind of symmetry between the sort of the unfinished status of the tower and the destroyed status of the tower in terms of the way it functions as an icon. Which is, I think that's why I keep going back to the sort of the unfinished, the images of the tower in which it's unfinished. right? Because I think that that's, in some ways, that's really what it's supposed to be about, is the process of construction and the sense of contingency and so on, rather than the solidity of a monument. Right? And so that there's something about the broken and ruined images of the tower that actually echo that moment of creation. So, but that's, that's a little theory.
I'm really interested by this idea of Japanese images as helping different thinkers across the world work through certain anxieties about the production of art in different emerging nation states, various colonial contexts. And I think you mentioned Benjamin and the sort of list of thinkers that you were maybe going to touch on in the talk, and maybe it just, for whatever reason, didn't get touched on. But when I think about France and the turn of the century and anxieties about aesthetic production, I think of Benjamin's, the work of art in production. I was wondering if you could touch on, the statements that you think are there about anxieties about aesthetics in the age of industrialization and urbanization.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're linked in the sense that I guess what I'm trying to suggest is that what the Japanese aesthetic means for, again, this is not for every single person, right? But I'm trying to carve out a tradition that is bigger and more coherent over time than one might imagine, right? So this doesn't apply to every single person, but to some people, right? Whether it's woodblock prints or the haiku or certain conceptions of film, they're interested in the idea of a sort of a possibility of a mass culture, of mass reproducibility, right? So even part of the haiku, the appeal of the haiku, for example, is that it's just much easier to learn, at least supposedly, right, as they understand it, right? I mean, I'm not saying that's true, but it appeals to them, this idea that, basically anyone who's literate can learn to write haiku, compared to, the weight of the sonnet tradition in Spain or something like this, right? So I think that there's a way in which, for the people who are sort of bullish on Japonism, that it's a kind of, it's a sort of a solution to that it's an affirmation of reproducibility. They're not interested in the erratic object. There is no original print, right? They like seriality and multiplicity and the possibility of moving across media and across genres and so on. This is part of what is exciting for them about it, both aesthetically and in terms of its commercial potential and in terms of its ability to circulate globally. The shadow of that is that what that suggests is a kind of, just giving up on notions of sort of like, the racial characteristics of art, or, or the embeddedness of the art object and practices of life, et cetera, right? And so for some people, that's part of the horror of it, right? And you find actually both of those things sometimes side by side in conflict with each other, because, it's never that simple. But I do think that it is essentially an affirmation of that aspect of modernity. Hence this title, this kind of slightly weird title, The Floating World, which I keep going back and forth about. But I guess I think of it as a kind of my own repurposing of the term, that it would at first seem to be kind of a book about the European fascination with the Edo period or something, right? There are a bunch of books called The Floating World, like Michener has one, and so on and so forth, right? There would be like another one of those books, which is why I'm kind of afraid to use the title. But then the point is that it turns out actually it's about like global modernity and capitalism, right? So it's a floating world in that sense. It's floating in that sense and world in that sense, right? And that one actually ends up being a good way of talking about the other, and that historically that's what it was.
Two questions, if there's time. One is a confusion in my mind about what you're saying about the Eiffel Tower and Riviere's version of it. And it has to do with what I heard that you should say about aestheticization, and not presenting Riviere's work as using the Japanese as a means to aestheticize. You wanted it more documentary or something like that. And yet when you were quoting from the beginning of the book, it was all about the beauty of the Eiffel Tower. The Eiffel Tower as Fujisan. And I wonder, my impression, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that when the Eiffel Tower appeared, if it was meant anything, it was ugliness, and it was an intrusion. And so in some sense, it makes sense to see the use of Japanism as a way to make something ugly beautiful.
Yeah.
So I just wanted your comment on that. How beauty relates something or not.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it relates a larger to the various. The other question is something you haven't touched on at all, but I'm wondering how you would whether the interest in Japan especially is like or unlike Orientalism, especially in France as this relates to North Africa, the Middle East, and the Arab world, which was the real focus of the exotic, throughout the middle of the early middle of the 19th century.
Yeah.
And whether these are completely different phenomena, or whether the term of Japanism is just another chapter in Orientalism within French.
Okay. Great. Thank you. I mean, on the first point, I think that's right. This is, unfortunately, I think that in the haste of talking and so on, I sort of lost some nuances. But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there is a clearly there's a kind of beautification, right? But I think, I guess what I was trying to do is to sort of distinguish it from, say, like kind of Whistler sort of Japonism, where you would have, there are butterflies and there's tea houses and kimonos, and the flowers are always in bloom, and so on. That sense of a kind of a prettification, right? Beautification in that sense, a kind of layering of putting a layer of beauty over the thing, right? I think the sense of the beauty that he's finding is more akin to the kind of the estrangement of the everyday that we would associate with kinds of modernist photography and so on. So things that might be even ugly in subject matter, right, traditionally acquire a strange kind of beauty when captured at just the right moment from just the right angle and so on. So I do think they're aesthetically pleasing images, to be sure, and there definitely is a kind of, but I think there's a difference between sort of saying, allowing you to see the beauty around you somehow, as opposed to kind of pictures of a place that's pretty in some way. And in a way, it's a small distinction, but I think I guess I want to emphasize it because it puts Rivière in a different lineage, or at least creates the possibility of reading that as an aspect of the work that links him to a different kind of art. I definitely don't, and as for the second question, it would be overstating to say that that Japonism is in no way, shape, or form Orientalist, right? I mean, clearly, there's a lot of that going on, and one can find lots of examples of that, and indeed, in sort of much earlier versions of this project, I had a lot of those things. But after having worked on it for such a long time, it really became clear to me that what was sort of what seemed to me anyway to be more interesting was the ways in which it was not like those things. And that I began to see a sort of a correlation, and that's what I'm arguing, is that there's a correlation between the historical and geopolitical events in the actual place of Japan and the way it's things that are actually happening in the world, and the way they are promoting a certain notion of Japan as a nation of art and so on and so forth, and the things that are going on in the way Japanese art is received around the world, right? So the point is not sort of, let's say, to defend the Orientalism that there is in Japonism, right? But to say that I think that in a way that critique has become so ingrained that it justifies blocking out the reality of Japan altogether, right? I mean, in fact, I've seen people literally say this in writing, right? They say, there's no point in finding out what's going on in Japan at this time because this painter wouldn't have known anything about it or cared anything about it anyway, but then in fact, sometimes when you look, they did. And in fact, they often knew quite a lot, right? And they had Japanese friends, and they had, whatever, and you start digging in and you find this kind of whole world of interconnectedness, right? And so that's what I'm sort of trying to get at, is that I do think that it's an aesthetic tradition that can be looked at in relation to that modernization and that distinct geopolitical status, which, whether or not we think it's let's say, a historical fact today, at the time was constantly described as the one non-Western modernity, the one non-white modernity, the one nation to successfully blah, 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 right? Whether or not we think that's true or it's overstated or whatever, that's sort of a different, but at the time that was the sense of just the absolute singularity of Japan, and it poses a kind of a conundrum, but it's also a source of excitement.
I think in the interest of time,
Yeah.
we should probably allow people to go to their next engagement, but join me in thanking Chris again.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry for being quiet and